Welcome to Unsheltered Conversations, the podcast from HomeAid America, where we explore the people, partnerships, and ideas working to address homelessness and build strong communities. I'm Scott Larson, CEO of HomeAid America. Today's conversation brings together leadership, innovation, and impact through the lens of one of the most challenging housing markets in the country, Northern California. And I'm joined by two incredible leaders, Glen Martin, a third-generation homebuilder and Managing Director at Avila Real Estate Capital, who's being inducted into the California Homebuilding Foundation's Hall of Fame after more than 40 years of leadership in the building industry. And Crisand Giles, Executive Director of HomeAid NorthernCalifornia, who's been leading innovative housing solutions, including tiny home communities and interim housing models that are making a real difference on the ground. Together, we're going to talk about leadership, innovation, policy, and how the building industry can be a part of solutions to homelessness. Glen and Crisand, welcome. It's great to have both of you here today on the podcast.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be here.
So Glen, let's start with you. You're a third generation home builder, and you've had an incredible career from companies like Standard Pacific to Toll Brothers, and now Avila Real Estate Capital. What first drew you into the home building industry other than maybe dad saying, hey, this is what you should be doing? Or maybe that's what it was. Tell us a little bit about how you came into the industry.
Yeah, I don't know if I was drawn into the industry or thrown into the industry. There were options, I'm sure. I didn't see any other ones. I grew up in a household that's what you did. And I was fortunate enough, my dad was able to put me out on construction sites at age 10. And from that point on, I worked Saturdays and summers for my father or for someone who worked for my father on these projects. So that started in Chesterfield, Missouri a long, long time ago. And I've enjoyed this trip the whole way.
You're in a league of a few people that I've talked to either personally or even on this podcast or in the industry in general that are multi-generational builders. And it really is a tremendous legacy. So I'm glad it's been embedded in you and all that has meant to things that we're going to talk about today. Over those 4 decades, what has been some of the most defining moments or lessons that have shaped your leadership along the way?
I'd say I don't know about too many defining moments. It's been a long, great trip where I've been fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who were very knowledgeable and very patient and caring. And that probably did start with the family. My father and his brother, also a contractor, a home builder. And then just on through my entire career, I grew up in the business. So we had a lot of the people in the industry. While I was in high school, I was able to get to know them. And then when I graduated from school and went to work, it was just one person after another my entire career that's helped me along. I'm passionate about housing. I'm passionate about architecture and land planning and creating spaces for people. So it was just fun to keep learning. It's to this day, I keep learning. So I enjoy it very much.
So was there a moment where you moved from the field to the office, and did that change your perspective on anything?
Well, of course. Yeah. I spent a number of years in the field as a superintendent and running work, some pretty big work actually as a young man, and then went into the office at age 28 to be a vice president of operations for a small home building company in Walnut Creek in Northern California. That's when my eyes did really open up to how much there is to do. I thought it was all the hard work was in the field. There's just as much hard work to get to the field. And especially in California. And I think that's one of the challenges that we see is, the entitlement and permitting and CEQA process that has become more and more challenging. So yeah, that was a big deal to understand all that goes into preparing a project to get ready to go.
Let's maybe dive into that a little bit because you've worked in high density, multifamily housing, and throughout all of California, that's important, but critically, some of those aspects in higher density areas like Northern California. Your experience, how's that shaped you into looking at real housing solutions? You've mentioned CEQA and some of the barriers that are there. How do you see us overcoming that so we can do more, either high density multifamily or even traditional single family developments? What do you see with that?
Obviously, we need change. I think Sacramento now is pushing hard to unwind some of the obstacles that have been put in place for housing. and getting priorities straightened out. Priorities are about people and about shelter, about housing. It's been a while since I studied Maslow's hierarchy in college, but I'm pretty sure that shelter is on the baseline. And
It
without
is.
it,
Yeah.
the rest of the pyramid doesn't work very well. I remember that much. And I will say that any impediment that we put to housing adds to a shortage of housing, a delay in housing, and an increase in cost, which is an affordability issue that creates a lot of our shelter issues right now. So it'll take some time. I think Sacramento needs to move the regulations, but to affect those, I think you need local planners and city officials, city councils to understand this sort of shift and have a mindset change that will allow these new regulations and further new regulations to take place and take hold and really make an impact. It'll take some time.
Obviously, there's the tangible component of building a home or building a community. There's the planning that goes into it. But what you're touching on is the human element and the impact that everyone needs a place to call home and we need to build it. And the state has limited that in so many aspects. And it's created the housing crisis, not only for people on the street, but for young adults, first time buyers, just even the movement within within the housing market. It's made it very, very complicated over the decades of what you've done in the building industry. So, Glenn, being inducted into the California Home Building Hall of Fame, it's a significant honor. And I've been to those ceremonies, and Crisand has been as well. And we've seen a lot of people in over the years that have been inducted. When you first heard the news, what did that mean to you? And how are you seeing this upcoming ceremony playing out for you personally?
I think the first thought I had is they've run out of qualified candidates. But, it meant a lot to me actually, because Bob Ravinius, who had run the CBIA for a great number of years and someone that I have a friendship with and a tremendous amount of respect for, he called and I just launched into a conversation about catching up with him and talking about housing issues. He said, "Time out. I have something I want to
I
tell
have
you."
something to tell you.
I was so happy to speak to him, So I was shocked actually. And yeah, it means a lot. It really does mean a lot. I kid about it, but, I have many close friends and associates, professionals I've worked with over the years who have been inducted, and I know what it means, and it means an awful lot to me as well.
You'll be in good company at that ceremony and something that both that evening as well as people that have been inducted over the years. And so I'm proud that you and others that are going to be inducted have this opportunity and this honor. So when you reflect back on your career, and maybe you've already prepared comments for this upcoming ceremony, what will you share? What are you most proud of that you want people to know about you and about the impact that you've made in the building industry?
I guess it really is. I am happy to have worked alongside so many good people to create products, create houses, homes, places where memories are made, childhoods take place. It's a great feeling to know that you've done that. And I get a lot of thrill out of going back to older communities that I've done 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, and just see how they're being lived in and how it works and seeing kids on bikes and things like that. It's tremendously satisfying, frankly. I've just appreciated being able to be part of that.
There's probably very few careers that one can do that with and go back and take a look, seeing people live in what you've created and the impact of generations. But you've also been deeply involved on how to get it done through policy. And you mentioned Bob Ravinius, who for many, many years led CBIA, but you've served on their codes and energy committee. And California is a very complex environment to build in. And what have you learned or what do you see from committees like that that they're addressing or that they need to address when it comes to getting housing built?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, I was fortunate for a number of years, 5 or 6 years in a row, to work with Bob Raymer, who was formerly the head of, before his retirement, was the head of codes and energy for the CBIA. And what I realized is how politics, philosophy fit together and how awkwardly they fit together. And often it takes the nerdy technicians, and maybe I fall under that category, to sit down with the state and with politicians and talk through how things really work and how things get adopted in the industry and how people live and use their homes. And it was fascinating to me. I thought it was sort of common knowledge how these things work, but I grew up in this industry. Those who are in politics and in state government have a very different perspective and they have different experiences. And in the melding of those things is awkward and ugly sometimes to try to get through that. But it's a process that takes time, even when new codes are adopted and laws are passed. It usually is a couple of code cycles to get it right, that refinement. So there's a lot to it. And, I really appreciate the people like Bob Raymer who put so much effort into this and can pull together the philosophy behind some of these code and energy changes, along with the politics and the mechanical piece. You've got to be wired differently to be able to do that. I wasn't so good at the politics, frankly.
Yeah.
Pretty good at the mechanics.
So do you see any innovation so much changes, and the industry often talks about innovation and needing to get out of the traditional ways that we've done things. But do you see any innovation, could be in construction methods, partnerships, or even policy, that can make some changes in these roadblocks or in what you were just talking about?
I think so. I think simplification would be great. I think we tend to overcomplicate things in this state with, great intention, but I think we tend to overcomplicate and it adds cost and time. Again, these are things that work against housing people, right? I think more effort needs to go into simplifying the way we do things and the way we bring innovation in, because it delays innovation. I think there are many things. Obviously, we're seeing over the course of my career, photovoltaics has gone from a crazy idea to something that really does work. It took a long time to make that, way too long to make that work. But that's just an example of the kinds of things. There are numerous things that even go beyond the code and legislative side. We have to just get into sort of philosophy of how we construct homes and how they're manufactured and that whole supply chain process. I think many of us are still high-fiving over the invention of a skill saw, which I think happened in the 60s. So we're slow to adopt because of the cyclical nature of our business. We're ready to do it. We're ready to things slow down. We don't look at innovation again. And we get into this do loop of almost getting there on a lot of innovation. I think AI and so many other things that are disrupting other industries are also disrupting ours. And I think that's fantastic, right? And I think the youth, that the new folks in our industry who have energy and who have a different way of looking at things and problem solving using different tools, that's what's going to move us forward. And I'm anxious to see what that looks like.
Yeah, and I am too, because you're right. There's so much change happening in every other sector related to AI and technology and innovation. It's bound to, and it is impacting us. So, Crisand, let's pull you into this dialogue. I know that Glen serves on your board at HomeAid Northern California, and you've been leading it through some really innovative work, especially around interim housing. I've loved seeing some of your developments come online and the tiny home communities that you've been able to work directly with Glen and others on. Can you share a little bit about what you're seeing on the ground and what HomeAid is doing to respond to some of those things today?
Sure. Yeah. Well, like Glen mentioned, the high rate of homelessness that we have in Northern California is directly tied to our housing shortage. We find that job creation continues to outpace construction of new housing units. Our current ratio is 4.3 jobs for every housing unit. In the Silicon Valley, that can be 8 jobs per housing unit. And so that competition increases costs for people to find housing. And it creates a larger, less sheltered, and growing homeless population faster than ever. HomeAid has had to experiment with innovative projects and try and create opportunities to find land in order to add housing units. So that's been the biggest change.
So some of that, you're talking about finding land, has been with the faith community, and particularly with the tiny home communities that you've been bringing to life. And what I've seen both in person and online and in the plans, they're independent homes with kitchens and bathrooms that have been built very efficiently at a low cost. Can you walk us through how those projects came together, either with the land, the faith community, and physically the building or the design and the building of these tiny homes.
Yeah, the concept really grew out of this regional need for more permanent supportive housing. And by working with local builders like Glen and others and the faith-based community, these churches, we found that they had underutilized parking spaces. After COVID, they were still doing a lot of worshiping through Zoom or other technology. And there was an opportunity to layer in the community commitment that these faith properties have of service with small modular homes, constructed homes that these folks could live in to create these tiny home villages. And so we were lucky enough to learn from first units that we did that were wheeled and could be moved. And that what we really needed was spaces that had independent kitchens and independent bathrooms and were fully self-functioning as their own home for people to really lean into that housing and start healing. And so it just became this great synergy between the church, the community, and the builder in order to create this model. These churches are located centrally in neighborhoods. They're adjacent to shopping. They have public transportation that's nearby. So even their location within communities made it kind of a perfect situation to create additional housing that we were overlooking.
Seen a change in those communities once they've been brought in? I mean, either change in the parishioners that go to those faith communities, or what have you seen either in acceptance or maybe some opposition?
We've seen a little bit of both. I would say the biggest impact that's been surprising has been how the faith community has really integrated the folks that live in these villages that are part of their property. We had one project, we made all these raised garden beds. And so the folks that were living in the tiny home village were actually bringing those vegetables to the congregation on Sunday and sharing their harvest that they had that week. And that created some synergy. We found that that led to employment opportunities and maybe a ride to a critical appointment for someone that lived in the tiny home village, or even just a supportive conversation. And so that small housing village quickly became part of their community. So it's really great.
No, that's great. And with your model, you've been able to, I know there's been maybe challenges on entitlement, et cetera, but you've been able to build pretty quickly, bringing builders like Lennon and the trade partners. And some of those homes have been completed in a very short period of time and are making us using a significant amount of in-kind contributions. But you mentioned these gardens and the community, but what other impact have you seen with the individuals or families that have moved into these homes? Have they gained the stability that they've needed, jobs, future opportunities of moving into other types of housing? What have you actually seen as a result of what you built?
One of the biggest things we learned is not putting on a timeline on how long someone's in one of these units. And when you say it's for 18 months or it's to launch them into, maybe a affordable rental situation in the future, it creates an immediate amount of anxiety in that individual that right when they're placed in a home, they're already worried about this timeline and when they're not going to be in this home any longer. And so we work with care providers that don't work with a model like that give that individual the time and space in that home for what they need to heal from their life situation. And so I think that having more of these projects available, having them part of the community just creates a balance where all of those other things in their life that they're working on can come together. And then they're able to move on into maybe affordable housing situation that's nearby or a senior housing situation that's nearby. But this becomes like a critical time for healing in order to make that transition happen.
That's a significant component that maybe a lot of people don't think about, that the individuals and families that you're talking about, so much is disrupted. And for your communities and the people that you're working with to not have that, you have to leave. And even if it's as far out as 18 months,
Yeah.
you're right, that creates a level of anxiety that maybe the average person doesn't even think about. That's a significant thing. I'm glad you brought that up. So Glenn, when you first heard about these types of projects, you're sitting on the board of HomeAid Northern California. There's been a variety of different types of projects. When the concept of the tiny homes or the modular housing, that innovation approach came, what stood out to you as a different perspective, or what did you wrestle with or not to get that approved to dive into?
Well, that was easy for me. I loved it. We've done so many projects over the last 20 years with HomeAid. I've been around HomeAid in Northern California a very long time. In fact, I will tell you that the fourth generation of our family who is involved in this business, my older son, Nick, works for us. He first started working at HomeAid, was a senior in high school, and he jumped in and organized all of the files for HomeAid. It was
Yeah.
one 4-drawer vertical file cabinet. So that was one of his chores as an assistant. So we've done so many different kinds of projects and some more successful than others, frankly. And the thing I really appreciated immediately about the tiny home projects is everyone can be involved and do the things that they normally do. These are homes. And our trade base understood that. They were something that we could spend the time on to get absolutely dialed in and get it right, get every nut, bolt, screw, 2x4 figured out and set it up for replication. Anything we can put that kind of an investment in and then see future returns on other opportunities is so different than a lot of the things we were doing that were one-off kind of opportunities, whether it was a navigation center or it was a home, whatever it was. We didn't get the benefit. The process we would get a benefit from each time we'd learn something, but this was something we could replicate very easily. It required a big investment to understand how we could do a pop-up factory in the state of California. We figured out that formula with HCD, created a manual around that, a layout. We created some interesting terms to describe it as a factory that they kind of winced and said, okay, we'll agree with that. But they approved it, and they approved it without much trouble, frankly. And we were able to put something together that can be replicated from the build side and then in the field side and what that process looks like. So I love the idea. Bite-sized pieces that could be replicated. It was something fantastic. We knew it right away.
That's great. And I've seen the design, and I've actually seen some of the homes that have been built. Were you involved with that design? And is there anything you talk about, whether or not the efficiency or being able to be replicated, that you could share that's special about these homes?
Yes, the one size doesn't fit all. You have to look at sort of the target audience, and they are slightly different. And even within a project, you may have to have a different type of unit. For instance, an ADA unit is very different design than a non-ADA unit. You look at, will this be a single mom with a child? That's a slightly different look and how you lay things out. So we spent a long time, painful amount of time sort of looking at these variants, but also still putting some product out. Just, the amount of time that the architects and the engineers and the build teams put to get this figured out was amazing, but well worth the work. To the extent we could, we always standardize size of windows and doors. It's nothing different than you would do in an entry-level house, to where you have to be concise with that square footage. This is that same program on steroids. We fought for inches everywhere we went on the design here.
So for our listeners, Crisand, what is the actual size or range of square footage so they can know what we're talking about that is considered a tiny home?
So it's about 250 square feet, give or take. And it lays out kind of like a single unit mobile house where you'd have a bathroom on one end, sort of a kitchen in the center, and a bedroom at the other end.
That's not very big, but very efficient. You're right, Glenn, talking about inches, not feet. That's at 250 square feet, give or take. But that also allows you to be adaptable in where it's going to go. On these church parking lots and parking spaces, et cetera. That's pretty amazing that you can accomplish that in that amount of square footage.
And we have to be able to accommodate ADA accessibility and other items on these projects because you're not sure who's going to be placed in them. And so having those larger bathrooms and larger areas in order for people to navigate that space is very important.
So this really talks about, and Crisand, you will know that this really resonates across all of HomeAid with our builders and developers and trade partners, how they come together and created very unique solutions. Glenn, from your perspective as a longtime board member, what role do you feel the industry needs to continue to play in doing projects like this and actually tangibly addressing homelessness?
It's a multi-pronged attack, right? I think the first thing is where we started early in our conversation, remove the barriers to entry, right? Make it easier, faster, cheaper to build houses, stem the tide of homelessness by creating more opportunities for housing. Start there. Then deal with the specific issues for those people who are unsheltered or are about to be unsheltered. Let's address that. I think that's a societal issue, obviously, not just an industry issue. We just happen to have the talent to be able to do a lot of these things. I think when it comes to things like what products do we put out, keep going back. It's a variety of things, right? It's apartments. We have to get more apartments, and some of them are very efficient apartments, get the price down. Everything we have to do is to try to make housing accessible as an industry. And we have to work with the state in the federal government to be able to do that. I think the other thing is, again, doing projects that can be scaled, right? And I think the tiny homes is one good example of a program that can be scaled, that can be taken community to community and get the product out, right? The faster and the more we can do, the better. And I think one of the beauties of that, not to just get focused on tiny houses specifically, but they're cute. Everyone likes a tiny house for the most part. And so when they put a tiny house in your neighborhood, maybe 5, 10, 12 of them, they're still a cute little community. It's a cottage community. And generally they're better accepted than a housing development that is targeted for low income or any of the things that, the government gets pretty involved in and often has a negative connotation. So I think these are things that are important about anything we do. So take what's best out of the tiny home program and use that philosophy elsewhere in housing opportunities.
Yeah, and that's really significant because the ability to use maybe underutilized properties on these church parking lots, reinvigorating that community, embracing these small cottage communities. There's so much good there in a micro way that can be replicated on bigger projects. It's like, well, if you can do this, then maybe you can do that. So thanks for shedding a little bit of light on that. So Crisand, what's next for HomeAid Northern California? What's on the dock, and what are you diving into in the future?
Well, we're definitely trying to work with local entities to reduce barriers to building and expanding shelter opportunities. The state laws that we have in California allow willing cities to expand their shelter inventories, but so many of our local communities are under no obligation to build them. And in some cases, they actively prevent efforts to build and open new housing that's like this. At HomeAid Northern California, we have yet to propose a new project that hasn't been challenged at the local level as we're going through approvals. And I think part of that is changing the mindset to work with folks to understand that we shouldn't be othering the homeless, to assume that they are somehow different from us. Each individual is one big life incident from maybe being in the same situation, losing a partner, losing a job, having a serious illness in your family. These folks didn't necessarily do anything terrible to be unhoused. And I think that stigma shift will help make it easier for us to build more housing and propose more projects with more understanding that there shouldn't be this fear about housing these individuals in your neighborhood. That should give you comfort.
Yeah, and the fact that there's more challenges with not housing them than with housing them. I mean,
that's how you get these RV parks. That's how you
correct.
get folks that are, living in these group situations that are very unsafe and are difficult to see and to drive by. So,
yeah. That's a dynamic that, because once somebody's housed, not that they're not dealing with their personal issues and things that they need to overcome, but you're solving a very visible issue that people want to solve. And the answer is right there. You need to begin to house these folks.
And they have to understand that even when they, come out in force against an affordable apartment project that's in their community, where are those people going to go? Like,
correct.
All housing is important, and everybody needs to rally around that in California to build our way out of this problem.
No, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about scale, or how do we scale these solutions, these tiny homes that you've designed and actually built. 250 square feet, give or take. Is that replicable in other states? Because California is very specific with what we can build, what we can't build. Does that help? If someone that's listening from either the Midwest or in the South across the country, would these plans scale in their communities that you've designed?
Most definitely. And they can learn from the different product types that we've had in California to kind of land on something that lasts for at least 50 years. Is, if you manage and care for it just like you would the home that you live in, that property is going to be there for decades to come. And the amount of folks that you're able to help during all of that time becomes exponential. It really changes the way people are living in the community.
Yeah, and that's great. Glenn, any thoughts on the replicability across the country?
For sure. I mean, it's another arrow in the quiver, right? There are other options that we have and any geography would have, but there is absolutely no reason that they can't realize the same results that we've seen here anywhere across the United States.
And in some cases, they won't be dealing with the same building code, so they'll be able to be faster and cheaper than we can in California.
Exactly. And Glenn, you mentioned the pop-up factories. That may not be needed, let's say, in Texas. They could probably build it anywhere. But kudos to you and your team for figuring out how to do a pop-up factory. And that was actually looking at state guidelines and issues that are maybe very California specific. But if someone needs to know what a pop-up factory is, you've got the guidelines and how that could happen. And for the listeners, it's basically building the whole home off-site of where you're going to be building it and then transporting it to another location. So they're pretty innovative. Any other thoughts on the pop-up factory from either one of you?
It just really saves you on cycle time. When you're going through the approval process in California, having that pop-up factory managed by the state of California as opposed to a local entity can carve out 6 to 8 months in the approval process in order to get these projects going. And that's critical time that we need.
Yep.
Yeah, it also gets around local approvals, really. That's the bottom line, right? It's a state approval with a third-party inspector. So it's much quicker, as Crisand points out. I think the other thing is we can determine the location of the pop-up factory such that it's more convenient for our trade partners.
Interesting.
This creates, speed in itself. It makes it a lot easier for them. And then we can use that same facility again later, right? For the different group, everything's in place and we know how to lay out that yards. It makes it easier on our trades, and that helps us on the cost and the speed.
Yep. So, Crisand, we often talk about within HomeAid, the three areas that we focus, our three pillars: construction, which we've talked a lot about on this call; education, which you've touched on a lot. It's educating the general community about issues related to homelessness. Politicians need to know the issues. They need to understand the solutions. But community engagement is one of the other key pillars. And HomeAid Northern California, you're doing all three areas. Can you talk about a little bit of the community engagement activities that you're doing and how those fit into both construction and education with your work with HomeAid Northern California?
Sure. Yeah. A great example is a project that Glenn helped me complete in Walnut Creek, California. The congregation was willing to do outreach to other church properties, folks that may have had, people that were a little nervous about how do you move in this population? How do they layer in with your services? Does this become, something that's sort of fenced off and separate from your facility? And having those people talk about their experience with having these new neighbors and having them become part of their congregation and helping them assimilate into their new housing and their new neighborhood has been a critical component to help change people's minds. Those same folks that lived across the street that were showing up at my hearings to say that this would ruin their housing prices or they wouldn't have equity in their homes any longer, could see the changes, could meet this population and had a completely different experience than the fear that they expressed when we were approving this project. And changing those minds shifts the entire community to be more accepting.
Yeah, it really does. And Glenn, I think that even within the building industry, as we've brought partners in, their eyes have opened up to how to provide these types of solutions. Any thoughts about the impact that this work has had within the building industry and how they now view solutions to homelessness?
Yeah, I think it just like it does with a neighborhood that we go to build a project in, it raises awareness about our industry and about housing and about shelter challenges that people have. And I honestly think it brings pride to what we do for those people who do it, who have a say in it, whether they're an electrician or a plumber or a carpenter, or if they're an architect or a structural engineer. We all get lost in this is what we do every day, but you get some great satisfaction out of seeing these kind of projects come to fruition. And then to be able to see the benefit to people who really need it reminds you that what we do is important to society and it's a noble profession.
Yeah. And so on that note, Glenn, you mentioned that your son has gotten involved. What do you see for the next generation of leaders in our industry, and what advice would you give to them, either on the topics that we've already touched on or something new?
I would say this next generation has grown up with a homeless issue where my generation saw it come about and didn't understand what was happening, and it happened a bit slowly. I have my own philosophies on why this happened, but I think that this generation has grown up and seen it and understands the challenge of it and how real it is, how important it is for society to deal with it. I have seen the younger generation embrace the challenge of trying to tackle this, right? It's important to them.
So for both of you, as we look to wrap up our conversation today, what gives you hope as you look at the future of housing in California? Because there's a lot of things that, well, we can't do this, or the barriers that are here, or policy, or even supply chain, cost of materials. But we have to be rooted in hope on everything that we do. So for both of you, what gives you hope for housing solutions in the future of housing in California?
There's a pause. It's challenging. Yeah, I certainly have hope. I have hope because of this generation. I have hope because there are signs the state government has done the math and realizes that the restrictions on market rate housing are creating issues of shelter for many, many people. Once that connection is made to loosen some of these guidelines and frankly, to put people first over some other things that the state chose to make a priority and lost sort of the balance. Now, I think we'll see that come back a little bit. It will take time. I feel comfortable that the state's going to move towards housing solutions rather than housing challenges that are created. I think that gives me the most hope. It may take 10 years, but I think we'll move in the right direction.
That's great.
I see a great opportunity for improvement as we see more communities adopting these accessory dwelling unit ordinances so that people can add units just like the ones that HomeAid is building in their own backyard. And maybe that house is going to be used for your college graduate who isn't quite launching because housing is so expensive, or an elderly relative who needs some support and can use that unit. All of that additional building helps offset the need for housing and creates more opportunities. It lessens the stress on low barrier rentals, which are the fastest growing community that's becoming unhoused. So I think that those changes, making it easy for builders to convert, emptying strip malls and commercial places and create housing in those opportunities as well, is a way that makes me feel invigorated on how we take this to the next level.
No, that's wonderful too. And I'm grateful for both of your leadership, because this whole conversation just brings us back to whether or not we're solving homelessness or the broader housing crisis, which it's all woven together. It requires leadership from people like you and innovation that we've already talked about. It requires people that have spent decades in this industry that are willing to maybe take a look at things differently, but more importantly, get involved. And people like you, Crisand, that are finding new ways to apply that expertise and challenge what's out there, say we can do something different, and we're here ready and willing to do it. So Glenn and Crisand, I want to just thank you both for being part of this conversation today and sharing both personal as well as your professional insights. And I'm grateful for your partnership and your commitment to what we do. And Glenn, congratulations again
Yeah.
on your induction into the Hall of Fame. And truly, it's an incredibly well-deserved recognition for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to join you today. This has been great. Crisand, Scott, thank you so much.
It's been wonderful. Thank you both.
So to everyone who's listening, thank you for joining us on Unsheltered Conversations, and we'll catch you the next time.